another very popular one. And there's a familiar pattern in some of this, which is that you wind up discovering that just as an earlier generation of law professors believed that their entire policy agenda could be read into the US Constitution, so we are quickly approaching the day when the entire policy agenda will be read into international human rights. And some of you may have noticed the coverage early this year when a UN body flayed the United States as an international human rights violator, and it had this long, long bill of particulars, 30 different things. And the Obama administration's response was to say, oh, it's so unfair for them to say that the United States is violating the international human rights of its citizens by not having government health care. Look at the strides we took just last year when we passed Obamacare. That was a major step toward bringing ourselves into compliance with world norms. And that, to me, I guess that was the kind of reassurance that actually left me less reassured than when it started out. If I had known that, it was going to be that, that was going to be a reason to pass Obamacare, I think I would have fought it harder in the first place. So let me try to wrap up here. The ideas from law schools give government more to do. I guess in that respect they are kind of recognizably ideas of the left. But it's not just that they give government more to do. They give lawyers and judges more to do. They give legal intellectuals more to do. And I think Friedrich Hayek would have recognized exactly what was going on here when he wrote about the tendency of intellectuals in every area to be attracted to ideologies that make them more influential themselves. It didn't particularly work out for many of the other disciplines in the modern university, but oh, how it has worked out for the law professors. This is good news for them. It is good news for many of their graduates. I'm not sure that it's such great news for all the rest of us. Thanks. I understand that we have some time for questions and answers before we break. Yes, ma'am.
Kathy Posner, not related to Judge Posner, but
okay.
He was mentioned in the book, so every time I see Posner, I get excited. I just pretend that I'm a lawyer. Love the book, Ready to Ready.
Oh, thank you.
Everyone who hasn't bought should buy. One of the things that I was thinking about when I read it, and everything is so democratic at law schools, but maybe it's that those who can do, those who can't teach. And we're not getting Republican professors, not only because they might not be accepted, but because they can get real jobs in the real world where they have to do something and produce something instead of only teaching 2 classes a week. So do you think it's that the Republicans aren't just as interested in becoming professors?
You've opened up a big question here. It's the question of to what extent the underrepresentation of right-of-center views is due to, it's been called self-selection. That is, the terms of very high-paying legal practice at big firms are more appealing to some people than others. You get a different and to many people preferable, I would myself much prefer the lifestyle, even accepting less money for it, that the law professors get. And might that be distinguishing between some Republicans who are more up for that, the pressures of big firm practice? I have no doubt that that's part of the answer. I think there is more to the answer than that, and I try to pick the different reasons apart. There is a clubbiness. You get admitted to the club by being acceptable to the people currently in the club, if this is a matter of being hired under law faculties. And it isn't necessarily conscious discrimination. It's a matter of comfort levels. Oh, you're working in an area that I already follow. Your mentor was a professor that I already know. This is not a conscious ideological bias, and yet it can make the libertarian applicant seem Martian. George Mason, oh yeah, isn't that a nest of libertarians out there? And I guess Alan Dershowitz, who I so often criticize, had a very good line when he said that everyone considers diversity to consist of hiring more of themselves.
You're appearing next week at Improv, by the way, what next? Yeah.
There's a question, yes.
Recently, the Dean of the Law School spoke to the Council on Global Affairs here, and the emphasis was on we need to adapt to a global legal system, not a U.S. legal system. And I guess what is your view on that?
I think that I'm sorry, which law school was it, the dean of?
Harvard.
Oh, Harvard, okay. It seems to me that international law is much oversold to students who should realize at this point that with the new governance structure not in place yet and probably to be resisted by the current US Congress, the jobs in international law are mostly jobs in things like international trade. Someone had a good blog post about this recently saying to the first-year law student, do you fluently speak at least one language of a major trading partner? If not, probably don't think about international law because most of the jobs are still in facilitating trade. Now, it is certainly much on the mind of many professors that down the road we will have every capital punishment controversy appealed not just to the US Supreme Court but to The Hague or Geneva. Maybe at that point there will be more room for criminal lawyers who know international law. Maybe healthcare denial will be appealable to the Organization of American States, but it hasn't happened yet. And if enough people have me come around and speak, it may not happen at all. So I would say, the schools fall in love with international law. There is, as I explained, a huge amount of foundation money from Ford and Soros and various others being plowed into the international programs, hoping to get a more globally oriented legal profession. 90, whatever it is, asymptotically close to 99% of the legal work out there, you will do just as well if you hadn't taken any of those courses. Yes?
Would Ave Maria, for example, be an exception to what you've been describing?
Ave Maria, for those of you who don't follow it, is a Michigan and Florida-based law school organized to provide specifically a strong alternative to the prevailing way of thinking and with Catholic flavor as well. Yes, it would, and increasingly, as people have seen the gap to be filled, there have been, I mentioned George Mason in the DC suburbs, which made a point of going out and hiring some extremely good scholars who were not getting the sorts of offers that they really deserved from their scholarship. There are signs that something similar may be going on at Pepperdine, where Ken Starr was the dean. So it does provide a market opportunity, and one of the interesting things here is that some of the people associated with some of these law schools are not even particularly right of center. It's just they notice an underserved area where you can pick up really talented professionals to teach, and some parents and students will greatly value the product of the legal education that it provides. I know that, yes, in back. Oh, in the corner there.
The pendulum swings on all types of social issues constantly. And how far do you think this tendency that you're highlighting will continue to go? Because it seems like the economic consequences of many of these policies now are starting to take center stage, given the obligations of the debt that's been incurred related to them.
I'm more optimistic in the book than readers may expect. I think that many of the things that I criticize hit their peak, maybe 15 years ago, and have gradually been getting better. In particular, I mentioned that the extreme imbalance then is now only a pronounced imbalance ideologically, that the extreme impracticality and the rule of the theory heads, as they were called, peaked after it was eventually dawned on them that no one in the world of real legal practice was paying the least bit attention anymore to what the theoreticians were saying. So you have more engagement in real-world legal issues. You have the whole success of the law and economics movement, which, although ideologically quite varied in flavor, nonetheless teaches that there are costs and benefits to everything, and that you need to take measurement of consequences seriously. This is something that can only be an improvement on some of the earlier ways of approaching law. Now, just as I thought that I had built a case for some optimism, When I spoke the other week at my own Cato Institute, the commentary was by Judge Doug Ginsburg of the D.C. Circuit, a former Supreme Court nominee. And although he mostly agreed with what I said, he said that I underestimated just how awful the trends currently were because new schools had emerged. He was particularly hard on the behavioral law and economics variant that has sprung off of law and economics, and he said that the mischief being done by these newly formed schools would last basically long enough for me to never catch up with it. That was discouraging to hear, not, I guess, all that surprising, but it made me realize that one never does really defeat the different errors, one just encounters them in new forms. Yes?
Do you have any prescriptions for how to change the culture of the legal profession through the law schools?
I wish I had magical prescriptions. I think that for a very long time, those of us probably the viewpoint well represented in this room and at our institutes have tended to ignore the law schools, or if we paid any attention, just rooted for a few friends we knew were there, like Richard Epstein, the law and economics movement. And yet this is not how the other point of view has approached it. The Federalist Society is great in what it does. I'm always boosting the Federalist Society, but it can't really hold much of a candle to the hundreds of millions of dollars of philanthropy from Ford, MacArthur, and various other foundations, which have focused. Ford identified a very long time ago, certainly by the 50s, maybe even by the 1940s, the extraordinary leverage that philanthropy to law schools would afford them in changing the atmosphere of the legal profession and through it, the atmosphere in the law. The record of, one of the sub-stories that my book tells is the extraordinary success, occasionally mingled with failures, but mostly remarkable successes that Ford had in doing things like creating the clinical law movement, where every law school is now expected to have a bunch of clinics where students go out and sue people, often somewhat ideologically charged clinics. The growth of identity politics is an area in law schools tremendously fueled by philanthropy from the Ford Foundation in particular. The things that MacArthur has done with, I believe it's MacArthur that supported Bernardine Dohrn's project at Northwestern, of which I'm quite critical in my book. And so look for where the mirror image philanthropy from a libertarian or freedom-minded standpoint is. And it's hard to find much more than law and economics and the Federalist Society. Do we have time for any more questions, Nikki? Two more? Okay. There was one at this table, or is...
Well,
okay, yes,
I
sir.
Anyway, and that is, people like me who are not lawyers but are interested in liberty are always seeming to be on the defensive anything we do. And I'm wondering, to follow up on Jim's question, to follow up a little bit, is without putting too fine a point on it, are there any law schools that are offensive?
Offensive?
Offensive in the sense of working to actively promote liberty.
Oh, okay. Well, I mean, I guess I will give yet a third plug to George Mason, which is of all things a state school as part of the Virginia State University system, and as such you might see as potentially vulnerable to politicians in the future, but because they are in the DC area, because they've hired some of the brightest libertarian scholars, as well as, they do not try to provide a lopsided classroom experience, and they have some extremely good scholars on the left as well. But the work that they are doing indicates that there is a lot of ferment and interest to be had by bringing together good minds who all have a particular way of approaching a problem. That having been said, part of what makes it so difficult to reform this area is that everyone, and I'm afraid I include myself in this, tends to join in the advice to future law students: go to the highest ranked place that takes you, even if it's more expensive, even if it's at the wrong end of the country, because that's so terribly important to your future chances of who's going to come around to recruit at those schools and so forth. Now, I feel as if I ought to reproach myself, and yet yesterday someone was asking, should I drop 30 points in the rankings in order to go to a more ideologically satisfying law school? And I had to say no. Not if you are mostly concerned about the career you'll have.
Quick follow-up to that. It seems to me that as a non-lawyer who distressingly runs into lawyers.
That's the context in which most people run into lawyers, is distressingly.
I would prefer to deal with those who, and would pay a premium for those who think like I do, because they will better represent me.
Yeah, that's interesting. And to the extent that that kind of pressure begins to be felt from sources of jobs. And I think you may see it around the edges in areas like military law, for example, where I think it's believed within the Judge Advocate General Corps that there are campuses that where the students will get a reasonably sympathetic view of military law as part of an education, and other ones where they won't. It wouldn't surprise me if there was more of a hiring pipeline. Indeed, I've heard with respect to particular schools that there was a good hiring pipeline to schools that were not on principle anti-military. Likewise, possibly with some aspects of prosecution or criminal defense, although there I don't think you'll find as much of a difference among law schools. When it comes to economic liberty, I guess it remains to be seen. I have not heard of many people hiring for law firms that care that much about that. And indeed, I could tell stories from Washington, D.C. about just how many institutions that are supposed to have a mission will then not make sharing that mission fortunately, it's not true of our think tanks, but you go out to a senator's office who may supposedly be have been elected as a strong conservative, and you find that they'd rather take the person from with slightly better credentials and an obviously unsympathetic ideological record. Yes?
A quick one. Tenure in all areas tends to be a problem, and it would seem to me that that's a major barrier or obstacle in terms of any change.
Yeah. Tenure is flaring up as an issue now because suddenly there are proposals to not to abolish tenure, not to switch from one rule to the opposite rule, but simply to say that you can be in an accredited law school without having a certain rigid set of tenure rules. And of course, it's as if a nuclear bomb went off in the faculty lounges. I am not so consistently anti-tenure that I would recommend that there ought to be a crusade to abolish it, but I do think that it sounds like a very promising step to pull the accreditors out of it so that we can see how the market works. You may wind up with an equilibrium where a bunch of institutions retain strong tenure and a bunch of other ones don't. I'd like to see how that develops. And I think it would be better for student options and also probably better for people trying to break into law teaching than if you have tenure everywhere.